Hello and welcome to my video on the American Civil War battles of 1864. So 1864 is a really key year. It's also a really bloody year. There's a huge amount of death and destruction. There's an awful lot to look at. Again, this is just going to be a snapshot. There's no way I can cover all the different battles and all the issues of 64 in one video. Right. So at the beginning of 64, the Confederacy is really starting to feel the strain. The elections that they'd had in 63 had seen a growth of opposition representatives in the Confederate Congress, particularly from areas that were not yet occupied by the Union, such as North Carolina and Georgia. Obviously, in the bits that were occupied, there weren't elections going on, so it was still the old Democrats that had been elected before. There's a crisis in Georgia in February 64 when habeas corpus was suspended, and this was done to try and suppress disloyalty. And then we've got Brown and Stevens, who were the Georgian senators, who are actually at this point they're saying, right, I think we should enter peace negotiations, assuming following our next military victory. So again, we see it's starting to see a bit of discord amongst the Confederacy. In North Carolina, we've got the Order of the Heroes of America, who are an anti-war kind of secret group. They're connected to this guy Holden, and Holden then tries to run for governor in a midsummer election and fails, and the kind of things die down a bit at that point. North Carolina, which was maybe teetering on the edge of leaving the Confederacy, remains fairly firmly within it. The inflation is running absolutely rampant at this point. There's a large number of robberies going on across the South as people become desperate for food and other resources. And whilst all this is going on, Lincoln is also trying to start to reconstruct some of the South. And he's got this 10% plan, where if 10% of the previous the electorate, as it was in 60, are willing to take an oath of loyalty to the federal government, then they can start creating their own new state constitution. And this is happening in Louisiana. And we also see, actually, in the Republican convention in 64, we see representatives not only from Louisiana, but from Arkansas and Tennessee as well. So we're starting to see parts of the Confederacy break off or seemingly come more firmly under Union control. Right, so the Union and the Confederate armies at this point. So we've now got Grant at the helm. So he has been promoted to the rank of Lieutenant General, last held in the American Army by George Washington. Sherman takes control of the armies in the West. Meade is kept control of the Army of Pontomac, and Sheridan took control of the cavalry in the East. The Union now has quite a formidable military leadership, and this is, in a way, the dream team. These are the guys that are credited largely with winning the Civil War for the Union. But there are issues as well. So, and this is almost kind of like difficulty bred out of success. One of the things we talked about in earlier videos was the difficulty in terms of the pure size of the Confederacy. Now, 100,000 square miles of territory had now been conquered by the Union, but that then starts to spread their manpower really thinly because they need to defend or keep control of these areas that they've conquered. So they do have a massive amount more manpower than the Confederacy, but it's spread thinly. It's also getting to this key moment where they've got their 3-year men. So these guys who have signed up for 3 years of service, they're getting to the end of those 3 years. So the big job for the Union at this point is trying to get those veterans to re-enlist, because these are good battle-hardened troops. 136,000 of them did, but about 100,000 of them didn't. And the conscripted men that were brought in to replace them were not to the same standard. They weren't battle-hardened, and actually a lot of them were conscripts, didn't want to be there, and a load of them deserted fairly quickly. So the Union's resources in terms of manpower are actually slightly depleted at this point. But Lee's Army of North Virginia remained in good spirits. It's got highly motivated veteran troops who are determined to kind of see this out to the end. And though the counter to that is their supplies are in rather short order, and there are very few kind of reinforcements available to replace the dead and wounded. Now, Grant has got a kind of a big plan. So what he's going to do is rather than just kind of disjointed attacks, he's going to try and wrap everything together in 64. So he thinks this is where the Union's been going wrong up until now. And essentially he's going to try and pin Lee down whilst attacking other parts of the Confederate army to stop those bits reinforcing Lee, or reinforcing those different bits of the Confederate army. And the Lincoln kind of compared this idea of men holding the legs whilst Grant skinned Lee, and it was a kind of fairly graphic and unpleasant image, but that kind of idea. Now, the pinning of the legs bit, they're kind of holding Lee in place and taking on the other bits of the army. It doesn't go incredibly well, really, start off with Grant. For Grant, so in April and May, Banks has been given this mission to take Mobile in Louisiana, but he kind of failed in that mission. So he'd not moved quickly enough in terms of getting to Richmond, and then he's driven back at Drury's Bluff on May 16th. Sigels is given the job of taking Shenandoah Valley in May, and he fails. Defeat at Newmarket on the 19th of May kind of confirms that. So we've got parts of the plan slightly unraveling. Now, the two kind of really major bits of the conflict at this point are the Battle of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, which take place between the 5th and the 12th of May. And here we are seeing Grant against Lee. Now, the Confederates see some early success as Longstreet attacks Grant's left flank. Longstreet is wounded in this attack, though from friendly fire. He's actually shot by one of his own men. He survives, maybe slightly different to a similar story with Stonewall Jackson. Then on the other flank, Gordon is attacking Grant's flank, and Grant is taking really heavy casualties. So he's taking about 17,500 casualties compared to about 7,500 on the Confederate side. Now, normally what happened in the war up until this point, then facing those kind of losses, the Union troops, Union armies tended to retreat. But Grant was made of something slightly different. And instead he goes, no, we're going to strike back. So the Union is not going to fall back. And that's kind of the promise that Grant has given to Lincoln. And we've got Sheridan's cavalry destroying railroad track, and then also taking on Stuart's much vaunted cavalry at Yellow Tavern, and largely depleting or wiping out huge numbers of his men there, partly down to the fact that the Union forces got these rapid fire carbines, which are a new kind of rifle. So it means that they can shoot more than once, essentially, which is a big breakthrough in terms of the military capability of the Union. Stuck continues on. We see this kind of grinding out, this battle through the summer, really, of Grant versus Lee. The bulk of the armies meet again, all the time building fieldworks, digging trenches as quickly as they can. There's a partial breakthrough of the Confederate lines of what gets known as Bloody Angle on the 11th of May. The fighting is incredibly fierce. There's horrendous stories of just finding kind of craters just full of dead bodies and trenches full of dead bodies, and people just pushing the earthwork back over the top of them in terms of the burial. The fighting was really fierce. Lee falls back but builds further fortifications. Now we can see in this, the Army of the Potomac has lost 32,000 men in about a week. Lee's army has lost about 18,000. Now, proportionately, these are about the same because the Army of the Potomac is bigger than the Army of North Virginia. But this is an incredible scale of loss and really, really fierce fighting through here. So Lee is nice and secure at Spotsylvania, and Grant is attempting to draw him out into battle. They fight at numerous locations, at Totomotomy Creek. These two armies are just slugging it out, really. There's no quarter being given. There's big losses on both sides. Grant is trying to get it to maneuver Lee into a big set piece battle in the open. Lee is doing his best to avoid it because he knows at that point the greater numbers and firepower of the Union Army will really come into play. And as we progress through the summer of 64, Grant is losing about 2 men to every 1 that Lee does, as he kind of tries to press Lee. But he's got more to lose in terms of manpower, and he is wearing Lee down. It's not what he wanted to do. He didn't want this kind of war of attrition. What he wanted was a big battle in which he could beat Lee, but Lee was not giving him that. We then see an assault on Lee's army at Cold Harbor, which is an absolute disaster for Grant and his men, where he loses 7,000 compared to 1.5 on the Confederacy. We then see Grant sending Hunter into Shenandoah Valley, but again, although they weave a kind of a path of destruction, ultimately Hunter withdraws into West Virginia, and the Confederate force under Early is successful. So we then see Grant meeting Beauregard's entrenched forces at Petersburg, and then the siege of Petersburg takes place, and this stretches out through the year. As Grant can see, after some early kind of attacks, and there's one where there's the battle of the crater, and all kinds of horrendous things happen at Petersburg, but they essentially dig in. There's various attempts to break through, but they don't. And Grant, after really this initial clashes with Beauregard, had pretty much realized that his men were exhausted and needed a break. Meanwhile, in the West, we've got the Atlanta campaign, which is under Sherman. So he leaves Chattanooga with 100,000 men, heads towards Atlanta, the capital of Georgia. It's an important industrial and rail center. The guy he's going to be fighting is going to be Johnson. Now, one of the issues for the Confederacy at this point is there's so much infighting going on within their ranks. So Johnson has been undermined by John Bell Hood. John Bell Hood is complaining to Johnson about Johnson to Richmond, saying that this guy's tactics are all wrong. We should do it my way. We should be more aggressive. Johnson is blaming Hood, and there's an instance where actually Hood, rather remarkably for him, was more cautious than you would expect, and kind of lost an opportunity for defeating Sherman's forces. I mean, Hood is a really remarkable character. He lost his left arm at Gettysburg. He lost his right leg at Chickamauga. So this is a guy who literally the war cost him an arm and a leg up until this point. And with the infighting in the Confederate forces and the kind of the military ability of Sherman and the pure weight of men, the Confederates are being forced backwards. Johnson's retreat costs him his job. He's replaced by Buell, who's a commander of very little skill. There's a lot of argument that he should have been given to Hood, but Hood was seen as being too reckless. Hood is left defending Atlanta, and ultimately is forced to abandon it as the kind of position becomes hopeless. And this is a huge boost for Northern morale. So the war in the West is going better for the Union than the war in the East. Now Sherman left General Thomas to watch Hood and set off on a march through Georgia. Now this is some really quite extreme stuff. So Sherman essentially takes his men down because we're going to live off the land as we go, and we are going to live off the land, and then we're going to burn it as we move on. And they just left this incredible 100-kilometer wide kind of path of destruction going through Georgia. They caused $100 million worth of damage. They crippled the railway network. They kind of showed to the Confederate people that the Confederate Army couldn't protect them, and eventually Sherman's forces get to Savannah, which he captures in mid-December, and then announces he's giving it to Lincoln as a Christmas present. And this is real total warfare, and really is a real cautionary note here to the Confederacy in terms of keeping on fighting. This is what is going to happen. This is what the Union has the power to do to you. Now, in the the autumn, we finally see some Union success in the Shenandoah Valley under Sheridan, and they inflicts a series of defeats on the Confederates at Winchester, Cedar Creek, and finally, after some aborted attempts earlier in the year, eventually the Shenandoah Valley has been taken by the Union. And Sheridan here proving his importance as a commander. Now, we then see in the winter, we see Franklin and Nashville, and here we see Hood, instead of trying to stop Sherman invading Tennessee, decides that he's going to defeat Thomas, reconquer Kentucky, and then go and help Lee. As I said, Hood is a rather remarkable character. This is a guy who's lost an arm and a leg, but he's not short of ambition. Unfortunately for him, his kind of ability at this stage doesn't match his ambition. At Franklin, he launches what essentially are suicidal attacks versus the Union troops. His losses are 3 times higher than those of the Union. He's then going to try and take on Thomas, and Thomas then struck a kind of complete victory over Hood at Nashville. And this really highlights Thomas as another key figure in the war, one of the unsung heroes of the Union war effort. And he virtually destroyed Hood and the Army of Tennessee. And essentially, at this point, the war in the West has been pretty much won. And therefore, this is going to put even more concentration on that battle, that conflict going on in the East. And we're moving towards those final stages of the defense of Petersburg and then Richmond. Right. I've got through a huge amount in that. There was a lot of other stuff going on, most notably the 64 election in which Lincoln won, and there was a growing amount of disquiet in the North about the war, so that maybe Lincoln's victory wasn't as straightforward as you might imagine, looking back at one of the great American presidents fighting in this great struggle in the Civil War. And there were lots of problems, but I'm going to look at Lincoln and his role in the war, and his role in early Reconstruction in a different video at a later stage. So thank you very much for watching. I've now done videos going through the battles of 61, 62, 63, and 64. So unsurprisingly, the next installment, which will be coming out later on, will be looking at the end of the war and the final battles of 65. So hopefully this is helping give you a really good understanding of the Civil War and why it went the direction it did, and looking at some of the detail of some of the battles. Again, I'm sure any of you with great knowledge of the Civil War will watch this and go, right, here's a list of battles he's not mentioned. But we're only limited time. Right, thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, comment, and I'll be happy to get back to you with anything you've got to say. Thank you very much. Bye.